Fred.
Right, so once again, a very warm welcome to everyone. My name is John Earl, and I currently serve as the co-chair of the Uganda Studies Group. It is my pleasure to introduce today Dr. Moses Khisa and Dr. Adolf Mbaine. Dr. Khisa is assistant professor of political science with a joint appointment in Africana Studies at North Carolina State University. He is currently a fellow at Stellenbosch Institute for Advanced Study in South Africa. He graduated from Makerere University in Kampala with a BA and MA, and from Northwestern University with the MA and PhD. His research and teaching include comparative politics and political economy of development, politics of institutional change, and civil-military relations. He is a columnist for the Daily Monitor newspaper and a research associate with the Center for Basic Research, both, of course, in Kampala. He is also a member of the Council for Development of Social Research in Africa in Dakar, and he has published in Africa Development, Third World Quarterly, Commonwealth and Comparative Politics, Civil Wars, Review of African Political Economy, the Journal of Eastern African Studies, among other journals. He has 2 books forthcoming this spring and summer, respectively, one on rethinking civil-military relations in Africa, which is co-edited, and Africa's New International Relations, co-authored, both with Lynn Reiner Publishers. His presentation today is entitled Autocratization in Uganda, Coercion, Clientelism, and Contestation. We are very fortunate to have with us as our discussant today, Dr. Adolf Mbaine, who is lecturer at Makerere University's Department of Journalism and Communication. And in addition to his publications, he has called for very widely and publicly the review of Uganda's media laws, policies, and regulations. So we're very pleased to have you with us today, Dr. Mbaine. Dr. Khisa will begin the presentation, the discussion, and then Dr. Mbaine will respond, after which we will open our forum for conversation and discussions. So without further delays, I'm pleased to hand this over to you, Dr. Khisa.
Well, thank you very much, John. I hope you can hear me all well. And I hope everybody is fine wherever you're joining us. Good morning for those of us who are in the US, and good afternoon in Europe, and good evening in East Africa. Thank you very much, John, for the very kind and generous introductions. It's a great honor for me, and I'm thrilled to be able to speak on this subject and to speak under our Uganda Studies Group Forum of the African Studies Association. Let me, from the outset, say that I initially intended to write a book monograph on political development in Uganda since 1986. Within the spirit of my broader scholarly interest in studying political development and comparative perspective in Africa. And I wanted to sort of take a big brush survey of the major trends and transformations in Uganda's political landscape since 1986. But then I quickly realized that perhaps I did not have enough intellectual bandwidth to be able to do a project on Uganda, because I wasn't too sure that I knew well enough. And so I decided that I should reach out to people who I think better informed than I, and who could make a far more compelling contribution. And so I reached out to a number of colleagues, some of whom actually are on this call for this seminar presentation, and we agreed that we could try and do an edited book volume instead of me writing a monograph. But we also agreed that rather than a broad brush sweeping study of political development in Uganda, it would be perhaps more interesting if we focused on a more pointed question. And so we came down to a question that is quite, known to most Ugandans, puzzling to many people, and has been debated, discussed, and analyzed for a long time, but which nevertheless just cannot go away. And we seem not to have enough of it. It is not by any means a new question at all, but that's, it's a question that remains a big puzzle, and still requires intellectual intervention in a variety of ways. And that is, how and why has Museveni been able to rule a country as diverse and as complex as Uganda for such a long time, close to 4 decades of his rule uninterrupted. And a related question that we try to interrogate in this book is, why has Museveni's rule taken a very decidedly personalist autocratic trajectory with a lot of important institutional, constitutional, and legal checks and balances being eroded over the last couple of decades? Why has that direction become far more pronounced? Not that it wasn't there, in the beginning, but it's taken a more decidedly clear path in the past decade or two. And so what I'm going to do in this talk over the next 30 minutes, and then I leave sufficient time for Q&A, is to sort of lay out some of the core aspects of what we are trying to do in the book, and then introduce briefly the theory that anchors the book, and then I'll provide some quick reflections on what why this book is necessary in a practical sense for Ugandan politics. So let me start by pointing out that there are 2 core features that have come to characterize Museveni's rule in Uganda, and that is that his rule has been incredibly resilient and has been characterized by longevity, ruling the country straight on since 1986 to the present. And if you see the 2 photos of the same man, they give us a stark contrast of just how one man has shifted from being what he was in 1986 physically to what he is in more recent years. Perhaps some people who may not have as sharp eyes, including myself, my eyes are not very good, I perhaps would not easily tell that these 2 people are actually, these 2 photos are actually of one person. But the second feature is, as I pointed out a moment ago, is that Museveni's rule has increasingly drifted towards being more and more personalist, a system of personalist rule, approximating to an imperial presidency where the rule of the country is built around an individual. Not that other individuals and institutions don't matter, but in the final analysis, when shove comes to push, a great deal of things that go on in Uganda are now very much built and centered around the individual of the president. Now, this is all puzzling, and and I've reflected on this issue for a long time. How is it that a country as complicated as Uganda can be ruled by one person, especially when you consider that that was not possible before he came to power. So this is puzzling for many reasons. Number one, pretty much all Museveni's peers across the African continent have been swept away. They have left power, one or the other, with the sole exception of 2 people who are now ahead of Museveni in the pecking order, and that is Theodore Obiang in Equatorial Guinea since 1979, he's been in power, and Paul Biya in Cameroon since 1982. Now, I should quickly say a thing or 2 about those 2 countries. Equatorial Guinea, as many of us may know, is a small nation, tiny nation with a small population, and yet has a lot of petro money, has a lot of petrodollars. Officially, it is Africa's richest country by GDP per capita, upwards of $15,000. Yet, of course, it is also one of the poorest countries on the continent when you take a more qualitative measure of the Human Development Index. So Equatorial Guinea is in many ways unique in the sense that it's a small nation, very small population, has a lot of money that is, largely controlled and monopolized by the ruling class under Theodore Obiang and his brother, his son, who incidentally recently was visiting Uganda. And over the years, Theodore Obiang has actually built up a very cozy and close relationship with Museveni. Our troops from the UPDF are actually in Equatorial Guinea, in Malabo, helping out with Theodore Obiang's, security needs in that country. And that's also a country that, before Obiang came on in 1979, had been ruled by his uncle, whom he murdered, Marcius Obiang. And so it's been, that pretty much, two rulers since the country got independence. And same thing actually applies to Paul Biya. So Paul Biya rules Cameroon, which is another country with a relatively small population. It's geographically big, but it also has a lot of, resource wealth, particularly oil money. And Paul Biya actually rules Cameroon from Paris and Zurich. He's hardly in Cameroon. He only goes to Cameroon to preside over festivities and official functions. Otherwise, he's able to rule his country in absentia, which is quite extraordinary. So those are the two sort of exceptions. And with all due respect to those two countries, I think that Uganda is a far more complicated country for somebody to rule for such a long time compared to Equatorial Guinea or Cameroon. The second aspect that makes Museveni's own rule quite puzzling is that he's had to deal with a lot of challenges and a lot of threats to his power, right in earnest from 1986, armed rebellion, and in more recent years, unarmed activism and struggles, including street protests, whether you're talking about walk to work or people power movement more recently. All these have been severe attempts at trying to wrestle power from Museveni, but somehow he's been able to weather all sorts of storms over the course of the last more than 3 decades of his rule. And so there is, obviously questions to be raised about, how come he's not, being ousted. Museveni hasn't lost power in ways that, for example, some of his peers did a few years ago, whether you're talking about, Robert Mugabe in Zimbabwe, or more recently, Omar el-Bashir, and earlier during the Arab Spring, of course, Hosni Mubarak, who had been in power for such a long time, got pushed out via popular protest as well as a disguised military coup. Okay, so just some quick context, which is some facts that are familiar to most of us, I think, on this call is Museveni has been in power for a combined time that is more than that, for a time that is more than the combined time of all previous presidents before he came to power. So the 7 governments we had between 1962 and 1986, their time combined is less than what Museveni has spent in power, which is quite extraordinary. It's an extraordinary feat when you think about it. And the second thing is that since 1986, Uganda's population has more than tripled. In 1986, our population was perhaps about 16, 17 million. Now it is estimated at 40, 45 million people, perhaps even more. And of course, the vast majority of Ugandans today know only Museveni's rule. Most Ugandans are under the age of 35, 30, and most don't know anything about what was happening to the country before. And so one question is why hasn't the crop of Ugandans who have grown under Museveni been a problem to him in terms of providing the fuel that potentially could imperil his rulership, the same way that young people in Tunisia, in Egypt and other North African countries were able to push the wheels of change and bring to an end long surviving authoritarian rulers in North Africa. Why hasn't that happened in Uganda? as I pointed out a moment ago, from day one, Museveni has also had to deal with, a lot of, challenges to his rule, armed rebellions right in earnest, beginning in 1986 and up to at least about 2007. He was very much involved in fighting insurgency, something that he relished doing. Museveni always enjoyed very much being in battle with people who were challenging him on the armed front. Now, I should also point out one, trivia, which is that in 1986, Museveni's son was a 12-year-old boy, and come to think about the fact that today General Muhoozi is a 3-star general in the Uganda People's Defense Forces and rumored to be an heir apparent. I mean, it just says, a lot about how the father has been in power for such a long time. His son, who was only 12 in 1986, today is a 3-star general and rumored to be in the queue, ahead of everybody trying to succeed the father, if at all there's anything like a succession plan. And then just one last quick point to underline is that, in 1986, I don't know whether many Ugandans actually had heard about the word internet. And today, 36, 37 years later, the internet is such a powerful tool and an important force on the Ugandan socio-political landscape. So, the times have changed in very, very extraordinary ways. Today, we live in a completely different digital era from the time in 1986 when Museveni captured power. So, extraordinary changes happening, not just on the socio-political landscape, but also in terms of, technology. All right, so what I do in the book project is sort of try and look at the large comparative politics literature on authoritarianism. A lot of the literature in comparative politics has tried to look at the role of institutions as being key in aiding and sustaining long surviving regimes. So the role of elections, the role of legislatures, and other institutions that help in different ways in enabling, even as they constrain. So institutions are important in many ways. They can create checks and balances against incumbent leaders, but institutions can also be instrumentalized in ways that make them serve the regime survival needs of incumbent governments. And so there is that literature which it's been around for quite a while. There's also, of course, the use of sheer coercion, brutality, and the power of coercion is critical in enabling regimes stay in power for a long time. But this is something that tends to be unsustainable for the long haul. Hosni Mubarak in Egypt coercively held on to power for such a long time, but it got to a point where the military could not continue doing his bidding in using force against protesters, especially when the Arab Spring came around, and Tahrir Square provided the basis for pushing him out. And then there is whole literature on patronage and clientelism, use of especially natural resource wealth revenue. And Muammar Gaddafi was perhaps most reputable in using large supplies of petrodollars to be able to buy his way around staying in power for such a long time. But these resources and flow of monies can be unsustainable sometimes. And in the early 1990s, many long surviving African regimes that faced revenue shortfalls, they found that they couldn't pay their way to being in power. And when protests broke out, it was easy for them to be pushed aside because the financial wherewithal had been exhausted. And other sort of explanations that I deal with in the book, and which I don't want to bore the audience with here. But so I build on these sort of existing arguments about a politics of authoritarian survival to propose what I consider to be a theory that is suited for explaining especially the Ugandan case study, but could be adapted to helping provide insight and shed light on other similarly long surviving authoritarian regimes across the African country. And so I propose a theory of adaptability as a way that we can understand Museveni's long rule, but also why his rule has become a lot more personalist and more autocratic. And so the theory of autocratic adaptability, as I call it, is what anchors this book's project. And I point out that Museveni has been very adept at adapting, adept at adapting and being able to adjust to the new needs and changing circumstances of the time. He's been very good at recalibrating things, and he has also been a very pragmatic guy. At different times playing ball differently, and adjusting as and when the circumstances have demanded. But he's also been, I think, a beneficiary of contingency, and one would even say, I think he's been, in some instances, lucky as well. But luck, as they say, only benefits those who are prepared. So what I try to show in this chapter for the book is to, sort of make the case that, adaptability is core, is central to survival. And so, survive means that Museveni and his regime have had to adapt to changing circumstances, because to be able to survive, you have to adapt, and to adapt, you are able to survive. Now, of course, somebody might point out and say, no, this is a rather circular argument that you are making, and I think it would be a fair criticism to point out that there is a circularity in what I'm trying to say. But let me sort of shed some light on what I'm trying to say here, and then hopefully maybe the circular aspect of the theory may be able to it may be put in better context and better defended. So I propose that there have been three core pillars that we can place in this theory of autocratic adaptability in the case of Museveni. The first one is what I call institutional mosaic and manipulation, and I will say a bit about that in just a moment. And then secondly, resource pool supply as another pillar, and here sort of combining a fine balance between the use of both finance but also force. And here I try to show how mobilization is core, but also sustainability of the resource pool supply. And then the third pillar is that of renewal and replenishing the ruling coalition. And so I'm going to take these one in turn and see how they can help us make sense of what has been going on. So let's begin with, so I mean, same sense you can summarize these three as speaking to institutions, resources, and coalitions. But let's take each in turn and pass them out a little bit. Okay, so institutional mosaic here, speaking about institutions as being very important, and this is sort of ironic for many people who think that Museveni's rule is very personalist, and that somehow Uganda is institutionalist. There is some truth to that, but it's also the case that actually Museveni's rule is very much anchored and based on the way he's able to play around with institutions. Institutions do constrain governments, do constrain rulers, do constrain elites, but they also enable. And so juggling the institutional complexity and uncertainty, because institutions place a range of outcomes that tend to be beyond the reach, the control of individuals. And so the extent to which an incumbent government is able to juggle and play around with the institutional landscape, I propose is central to autocratic adaptability. So if we take, for example, important institutional arenas and spaces like the legislature or elections, these in the context of a country like Uganda, have been incredibly important. You look at the national legislature and the roles it has played in, elite cooptation and in providing sort of the platform that Museveni, uses to ensnare and capture, the broad swath of elites, who otherwise, would be causing him problems. I mean, take for example today with National Unity Party, and it's being in Parliament, that is very important. You have NUP MPs in Parliament, leader of opposition, and they are now in many ways co-opted and captured by the system, and they're using Parliament to oppose Museveni, but to what end? So and in Uganda, the Parliament, the national legislature, has been for a long time such an important platform as an institution through which Museveni is able to co-opt and to capture. But elections have also been very important. So in the book, we do have a chapter, for example, dealing with elections and showing how over the past many decades, elections have been such an important institution for Museveni's politics, to the extent that elections help in mobilizing nationwide popular appeal for all sorts of activities that Museveni is involved in, but also using elections to make the case as to why he is the guy and other people are just jokers and who should not be trusted with the leadership of the country. So not to go into too much detail, what I do in this theory chapter is to show how Museveni has succeeded in managing the institutional landscape through manipulation, but also through multiplicity. So you have a mosaic of institutional arrangements, but which are instrumentalized for purposes of regime legitimation, but also for regime survival. And he's been very effective at doing that. And so different chapters in the book sort of touch on the different institutional nodes that come together in providing the basis and the bedrock upon which Museveni's rule is built, even though his rule is personalist as well. So despite being sort of a personalist system, it nevertheless draws on and benefits from the institutional landscape that is a mosaic of all sorts of agencies and bodies and so on and so forth. And then secondly, the aspect of resource pool supply is critical. No authoritarian regime anywhere has ever survived for a long time without having a fair and steady supply of resources, particularly financial resources, but also resources that that make possible the use of force and coercion. And so internal revenue generation is critical, and this has been something that Museveni has effectively done, but also extracting rents from outside sources. And so in the book, we have a chapter that deals with that. And of course, in Uganda now, now there is a lot of anticipation around oil money as well. And that has just, I think, compounded the situation, because the politics of clientelism and using natural resource wealth to oil an authoritarian regime, I think, are just going to deepen. And so in the book we have a chapter that deals with the evolution of clientelism in Uganda and how it's come to be especially to be so pronounced with the oil revenue on the horizon with the discovery of oil in Uganda. So what I show in the chapter is how Museveni has been able to handle the resources that he needs for his rule, beginning in the 1990s with macroeconomic stability that has been critical and provided a steady supply of revenue generation, but also his handling of external allies, particularly the West and their provision of foreign aid rents that have been very, very important for the sustenance of an otherwise very, very expensive public administration regime and a very costly system of rule that has been in place. And then the third pillar is that of managing the ruling coalition. And this is, I think, I mean, I don't know, I take all three to be, sort of very, very important, but, I consider this to be such an important pillar of Museveni's role. Almost all authoritarian regimes need to have a coalition in one form or the other. There has to be a network of allies and associates with whom to govern, and Museveni has been very, very sensitive to this from the beginning, from 1986. The whole idea of the broad-based government was basically to make sure that he's able to cobble together and bring into his sway and under his control a broad spectrum of Ugandans who with whom to govern and who would be co-opted. But Museveni's ruling coalition has changed a great deal over the years, and the changes have been in tandem with ongoing socio-political realignments and the changes in the underlying structure of politics, but also the social forces. And so the balancing game here that Museveni has to play is very important. But one thing that is done very effectively is to continuously replenish and renew the ranks around him. And so what I do in this chapter and demonstrated in the empirical chapters of one of the empirical chapters of the book is to show how Museveni has been able to manage the changing forms and nature of his ruling coalition. But the core aspect that has remained constant is maintaining a semblance of inclusivity, even when there has been a shuffling of troops here and there, and troops both in cabinet as well as in the military. There has been a consistency towards having a seemingly inclusive ruling coalition. And the changes in the form of the coalition have at different times reflected his calculations about what is at stake. So you look at the current cabinet, for example, that was named last year, one of the most startling cabinets that Museveni has ever named, relatively younger, at an average age of about 46 years for a president who is almost 80 himself. He named a cabinet that is a lot younger than perhaps previous rounds of cabinets. But also you look at the actual personnel that were named. The fact that so many new faces and unknowns, so many neophytes, political neophytes, and so many individuals who are complete newcomers to Museveni's ruling core. It says a lot about his ability to basically outlast everybody except himself. And so the old guard, men of the old guard, being pushed aside, but he's able to bring in people, including some who perhaps don't fit the bill for the positions that are given, but nevertheless, he's able to get them to. So we deal with this aspect of how he's managed his ruling coalition as an integral part of the adaptation of his role. Okay, so I want to sort of wrap up in a few minutes such that we can turn to Adolf and his comments. The question that of course comes up here is, so what? Why is this important? Why should we even care about this whole aspect of Museveni's long rule and the deepening of his very personalist system of running Uganda? Now, of course, we've never had peaceful transfer of power in Uganda at all since 1962. Well, you can't say there was a peaceful handover in December 1980, but that's if you disregard the fact that Paul Mwanga was actually holding fort for Milton Obote. But that's the only time when there was some kind of, peaceful change of government. But we have, in a strict sense, Uganda has never had a peaceful change of government. All governments before Museveni came to power left unceremoniously and actually violently. And so you look at, all these former presidents, they were all kicked out of power through, violence and through force without proper, peaceful and well-managed change of government. So as far as I'm concerned, and I think that's why this book and the project is important, it's because Uganda's biggest political question today is the question of presidential succession. How and when will Museveni actually leave power? And that is the question of the day, and something that all Ugandans would be keen to interrogate. So the issue of presidential succession, of course, had been in some ways handled with the 1995 constitution that had provisions for both term limits but also age limits. But both of those constitutional provisions were removed in 2005 for the term limits and 2017 for the age limits, which means that the constitutional order and constitutional bargain that had been concluded in 1995 became pretty much eviscerated with those changes that happened in 2005 and 2017, in many ways opening up for the path to a life presidency in Uganda. And I have also argued elsewhere that that 1995 constitutional consensus, the elite bargain and consensus embodied in the 1995 constitution, has more or less collapsed, and the constitutional order in Uganda is pretty much, pretty much thrown by the wayside. Now that means Mr. Museveni has really been pursuing a president for life project, and we don't know of any, clear and apparent plans of him actually leaving power, and so that presents a big problem for the country, and because of that, there has been growing uncertainty around our politics and the growth in contentious politics, particularly over the last decade or so, with the walk to work protests and then people power phenomenon that came up a few years ago. So Museveni's life presidency project, as I see it, is driven by two key factors. Number one, he has this deeply held, and I think it's a conviction that he strongly holds, but I think it's also an exaggerated sense of messianism, messianic mission, to not just liberate Uganda, but liberate Africa. And he speaks about this with a lot of assuredness and bravado about how he's on a mission, and what is important for him is not that he's in power, but that he's in power to actually liberate Uganda and liberate Africa. Now, if that sort of somewhat narcissistic driver is illusory, the second, I think, driver of Museveni's life presidency project is a very, very practical matter, and that is the trap and curse of power. The longer he's been in power, the longer he's stayed on, the more it has become very unlikely that Museveni can think about him living a life of an ordinary private citizen in Uganda. And we know that in almost all his life, with the exception of the short period when he left the university in 1969, 1970, Museveni has basically done two jobs. In the 1970s and the first half of 1980s, he was basically fighting to be president. So he was a specialist in violence, a violent entrepreneur. And then the second job he's done is to actually be president since 1986. So he's done two things: one, fight to be president, and two, be president. And he cannot contemplate a life that is, anything other than being in charge of state power. So some quick implications. I'm going to end in just a few minutes, John, such that we'll turn to Adolf. Over the years, and I show this in this chapter of the book, is, you know, Uganda has degenerated from a period where there was some, you know, decent and modest principled politics, principled and progressive politics around certain individuals within Museveni's ruling coalition. We have moved away from that. And you look at the latest cabinet, it's quite instructive in the sense that, you know, you no longer have those very independent-minded individuals who could look Museveni in a cabinet meeting and look direct at his face and tell him that, Mr. President, what you're saying is wrong, or what you're planning that we do is wrong. That, I think, is very much gone. And then elections, you know, that are now so routinized, nevertheless have become quite useless, and not just useless in determining how the country is governed, but also they'll become violent. You know, the do or die fights, as a recent article in African Affairs pointed out. Elections, especially in NRM, has become very chaotic and very violent because the stakes have become high with a very financialized, you know, system of competing for office. Transactional politics has taken over from principled engagement, and Museveni himself now has to pay a whole lot to be in power. You look at the state largesse that have to be dished out, and his own, you know, motorcade, and you know, the budget for presidential donations, you know, State House and Office of the President budgets that are always, you know, shooting through the roof and requiring, you know, supplementary, you know, budgets all the time. It's just basically a representation of where the state of politics for the country stands. This also, of course, means that, you know, we've entered a period of, you know, out and out vulgar patronage and extreme clientelism that plays out especially between elections, but also during election times itself. And then the other implication, of course, which I sort of alluded to earlier, is that, you know, the minimum elite consensus that had been embodied in the 1995 Constitution has broken down, and constitutionalism in Uganda is in peril. And of course, you know, that also means that once the minimum elite consensus has broken down, the rules of engagement are no longer acceptable to the broader spectrum of actors. And so what we have then is politics of defiance and contestation between those in government and those in opposition. And then just one last point, and then I'll end there, is, you know, have, you know, the possibility of, you know, heightened factional struggles around Museveni, which means that succession is most likely to be chaotic, if not, you know, entirely violent when the time comes and Museveni has to be out of the picture. And so, you know, as I see things, which is rather, you know, on a dire state, on a dire point, in a rather gloomy, you know, note as a Ugandan, is, you know, pointing out that we actually sit on a precipice as a country. John, I'm going to stop there for a moment and turn it over to you and Adolf for the discussion. Thank you very much for the kind audience by everybody out there.
Thank you very much, Moses, for your stimulating presentation, which will certainly raise lots of questions and comments and material to think about. And so without delay, let me hand this over to Dr. Mbaine for his remarks.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? John, can you hear me? Thank you.
Yes, yes, we hear you.
I would like to thank, I would like to thank Moses for this very, very interesting work that he's done on autocratization in Uganda, coercion, clientelism, and contestation. By the way, when I shared the link with several people, I got feedback in the form of questions asking me if I was safe getting involved in this kind of discussion from this part of the world. And I said, well, I will go in and say what I can possibly say, and if there are any consequences, I will take them the way they are. Yes, so, but thank you, Moses. I read the first chapter, draft chapter of the book that is forthcoming, and I think it is quite well thought out, and really looks at Uganda in contemporary times in ways that are instructive. I would like to start my comments by just talking about something that I think is important. Moses delves into the Mr. Museveni era. I also realize that he omits mentioning anything about the NRM, and I think this is deliberate. He talks about Museveni, but he doesn't so much talk about the vehicle that Mr. Museveni has used over the last so many years, both in and out of government, specifically from 1981 or 82 or thereabout, the NRM organ. If you talk to people like our good friend, Professor J.J. Varia, he will tell you NRM is not a political party because it does not fit into that particular definition. But in Uganda here, it is called a political party. Whether this is a misnomer or ordinary reference is a subject of probably a side debate. Yeah, but you see, the point I wanted to state right from the beginning is that there is a history to all this. Where does it start from? Where does Mr. Museveni start from? Museveni is also, and his government and his longevity in power is also a product of our own history. Yeah, because Museveni does not simply come in 1986. He's a product of what was happening here, right from Obote 1 through Amin's era, the Obote 2 and the confusion, the mayhem that followed the overthrow of Obote in July 1985, and then you have Mr. Museveni now coming in 1986. And I think this history is important, or is rather instructive, in understanding what has been the character of Mr. Museveni, what he's been able to do, and perhaps what he's not been able to do based on historical and contemporary circumstances. So Mr. Museveni comes in, and I should say that that for us I was already an adult in 1986, and Mr. Museveni, or even slightly before, for purposes of what I'm going to say, and Mr. Museveni and the NRM came through as a progressive force. Dr. Khisa, you will note that even during the Bush War, university students and young graduates joined Mr. Museveni in the bush, and it was not really to have fun, because war is potentially fatal for anybody involved in it on either side. But it was because of the ideas that Mr. Museveni and his colleagues espoused at that time. If you take the example of, say, Major General Mugisha Muntu or Major General Henry Masiko and so on, Major General Mugisha Muntu had a ready job in the UPC government, because his dad, as you know, was a close friend. His late dad was a close friend of Milton Obote. And people like Henry Masiko were already assistant lecturers at university and so on. You wonder what they were going to do in the bush. They were pushed by the progressive nature of the ideas that Mr. Museveni and the NRM pushed at that time. And even when Mr. Museveni came into power, he was attractive to many people, to many young people. There are even people who joined the army because of of that kind of attraction and so on. And even when you look at certain things that we have tended to forget, like the NRM 10-point program, it was very, very inspiring. The 10 points: democracy, security, consolidation of national unity, and elimination of all forms of sectarianism, and so on. An integrated, an independent, integrated, and self-sustaining economy, and things like that. They were really attractive for a lot of people who looked to take a break from what was a chaotic past and thought and believed that there was a new beginning. And to be fair, I should say that there have been some achievements under Mr. Museveni and the NRM, whether it was a movement or a political party, as I said at the beginning, is a subject of further debate. But we probably all agree that there has been a considerable restoration of the economy. There are fewer shortages of essential commodities. The prices may not be pocket friendly for a lot of people, but there has been an improvement in that direction. There has also been a general improvement in the security of person and property, and so on. There is nobody fighting on Ugandan soil, I think, as we speak, and this has been for some time. And this is not accidental. It is because there has been a fair improvement in the security around the country, and so on and so forth. Improvement in social services. There are challenges there, but there are certain things that have been done. Involvement of the population through the systems like the local councils, improvements in infrastructure like roads and energy, promotion of women and education and empowerment of the girl child, and things like that. So there have been several things that have been ongoing that we don't need to lose sight of, although of course what you are talking about is critically important. Now, of course, you talked about the reasons, you theorized and talked about the reasons Mr. Museveni has been able to, outlast a lot of other people and set a record now going up to 40 years in power. And I agree with you. He's had to adapt. He has changed both in terms of economic policies, in terms of the politics, because when he came, he was opposed to multi-party politics. Now he's in multi-party politics. And I think that was not because he changed, because, due to his liking of multi-party politics. But the situation changed radically, both within and outside, and then imposed this on him. He has also changed the teams in the army, in cabinet, and so on. And then, of course, he's been able to play off international forces, international forces that could have, changed the status quo here through some means. And then, of course, we should also not forget that when Mr. Museveni came into power, he was also a bit experienced because he had been involved in government, in the UNDF government. And so he was already aware, he was already alive to the challenges of running a government and keeping things together, and probably staying as long as he did. So those are issues that I think are quite interesting, and I think you cover them from your presentation and from the draft that I have seen. Now, for me, of course, autocratization is a very serious matter. And I think people, both within the NRM government and even from outside, agree that there are concerns. For you, Moses, you express your concerns rather candidly. And it is very clear from the tone of your writing where you started off and where you are going. Yeah, but for me as a citizen and observer of current events in Uganda, I have narrowed down 7 concerns, and a lot of them you talk about anyway, but maybe you'll pick 1 or 2 things that you had not particularly focused on, but I have 7 concerns. One, which you elaborately talked about, is that a peaceful transition from one leader to another in Uganda remains fairly close to a pipe dream. Yeah, because I have told people on other fora that the things which Mr. Museveni has not been able to do will probably not be done by any other leader, incoming leader. Because Mr. Museveni has had the longest time, he has had full authority to do whatever he wanted to do. And I am concerned as a citizen and observer that we don't look very close to a peaceful, and you did explain this quite well, that all the other leaders have had to be chased away in one form or another. And we hope, I just hope that this is not going to be the case. I just hope for the sake of myself and my children and grandchildren, I hope that this is not going to be the case. But so far, there is no indicator on the horizon that it is going to be the case. Yeah, the second concern I have as a citizen and somebody who has been keenly observing political developments around here is the militarization of public life, the increasing militarization of public life. We have the military in parliament. The military are now involved in elections. They're involved in agriculture. They have been given construction and so on. Even in the fight against the COVID-19 pandemic, the military line was there, which is okay if soldiers can bring whatever. But if there is an overbearing presence of the military in public life, then it creates a huge dilemma, as Professor Mamdan would call it. Yeah. So if every aspect of life is, even when there is a need to quell 5 students rioting, which would ideally be, or demonstrating, which would ideally be, and this is not to say that demonstrations are illegal and unconstitutional, but which would ordinarily be a police matter, you see the military fairly close to the scene as immediately as this demonstration happens. And for me, I think this is essentially problematic. And I don't know whether I think this is something you'll need to resolve, or to include in the book, whether there is a functional relationship between the militarization that we see and the transition from Mr. Museveni to somebody else, whether the military will now be the main actor or one of the main actors in the expected transition. The third issue that I would raise as a citizen and an observer of our politics is the increasingly problematic elections. And I think you touched this quite ably, because our elections now are a byword for violence, rigging. Sometimes even people get killed, people get arrested, money are over monetized. And I find this quite problematic, because you see the problems that we saw in the 1980 elections have really been replicated in several of the last elections. And we don't seem to have taken lessons either from our distant past or from our contemporary challenges in managing elections to ensure that they are free and fair. I see this as extremely problematic. And remember that the 1981 Bush War was actually reportedly triggered by a rigged election. So this should be a concern. The fifth issue that I think is increasingly frightening for citizens like me is what I would think is disregard for the law and the constitution, which we see from time to time. And you can cite various incidents, so much so that even institutions like the judiciary have been systematically eroded. That judicial power now seems to me like negotiated. Sometimes you don't know what to expect from courts, even on key matters like human rights issues and so on, where you would think that courts would really put their foot down on certain things. And I don't need to go through the incidents and cases that we have witnessed recently that would raise reasonable apprehension as to the health and state of our judicial function in view of what is going on around this. Disregard for the law, you've seen court orders being basically disregarded, and you correctly talked about the constitutional amendments. We put in place a constitution in 1995, but it has been so amended over time as to become unrecognizable. And Moses, there was this debate raised by Dr. Benson Pusasiri, whom I think you know quite well, in the days before the constitutional amendment about the age limit, or what he called the basic structure doctrine. That if his argument, if I got him right, was that if the most important elements in a constitution have been removed, then what remains of it? It means that then you have, something that is not a document that is no longer going to be helpful. But I'm also quite uncomfortable about amending the constitution every so often as to make it completely unrecognizable from what it was when it was promulgated in 1995. The sixth, which is related to what I am saying, is that we have also seen a rise in human rights violations, of detention without trial, of trial of civilians in military courts that I think sometimes is not really justified. Arresting people, beating people, torture cases, and so forth and so on. And for me, I think this is a very, very serious matter. Whether it is related to the kind of politics that we witness going forward is really something would be interested in reading in this book as it develops. But I think as a citizen, I would be shocked or even surprised, horrified that, people can be detained, people can be arrested and detained outside the constitutional limits, not taken to courts of law in time, and so on, and tortured, and so on. And the case of Kakwenza is really instructive in these matters. And there are so many others anyway. And it would appear to me, sometimes people make mistakes, but when people make mistakes in operations and they are not held accountable, then it's a issue which you also talked about is related to corruption and profligate spending. Yes, corruption, I think, has become part and parcel of our public life in Uganda. We have institutions that fight corruption. We have the IGG, we have the DPP, we have several other institutions. There are even offices in the president's office directly charged with fighting corruption. The anti-corruption State House unit, we have even people fighting corruption in the health sector and so on. Now, that is a good, having institutions is very good, but we need to assess what they have been able to do. Because somebody told me over a related discussion that, yes, there are these institutions, but where don't they start from where we know that, or where we suspect the highest form of corruption to be, and then cascade. When they get a small person like me, yes, it's I'm taken on TV and showed people that I have maybe stolen some 5 million shillings. 5 million shillings is about $1,500, the equivalent of about 1,500 US dollars. Then eventually, yes, that is okay. But what about, the grand corruption schemes? When and how are they tackled? Those are the questions that we as citizens ask and really, really get worried about. Then lastly, I'm also concerned that there is a growing intolerance in our body politic, that freedoms of expression are not respected as much as they should be, or even used to be in the years gone by, and that freedom of the media now is really negotiated. I can tell you, for example, without very serious fear of contradiction, that media houses like the Nation Media Group in Uganda really operate under threat of closure anytime because because they are critical of government, and they have been warned and so on. We don't know when this will happen. We don't know what will be the trigger, but I don't think that should be the case then. And then, of course, this also now goes down to the criminalization of the political opposition. People arrested merely because they are organizing the opposition politics. They are not armed people. They are not violent even, but simply being in the opposition attracts the wrath of the military and related operatives, and then people get arrested, get tortured, and so on. There have been many cases in the public arena, and this is a bit frightening for me, quite frightening actually for me as a citizen and as a political observer. So in a nutshell, sometimes you wonder that if these things continue the way they are, you wonder if you will have a country at the end of the day to live in. Because these are, as Professor Karigire would have stated, these are really roots of political instability. When you don't have a fair process, when you don't have fair processes, you don't have a strong justice system, you don't have elections that, everybody is, they may not be happy about the result, but at least they trust in the, by and large, trust in the process. When you have uncertainty, which Moses talks about and so on, then you wonder whether you will have a stable country or even a country at all in the future. I don't know whether I add anything new to what Moses has already said. I think our issues and observations are fairly well related, but looking at the text and the abstract, I think that these are issues that worry me. But finally, I should say that please provide a fair historical context to this book in the form of explaining what has been happening in Uganda and so on since independence. And very, very lastly, I think, Moses, you also need to look at the character of the post-colonial state generally in Africa. And this is not, because with just a few exceptions, the post-colonial state in Africa has had very similar characteristics. Brutal, incompetent, times greedy, and so on. So in the process, then it became fairly well disconnected from the population. And very often when this happens, then you get the kind of situation that has been happening prior to when in Uganda, prior to when Mr. Museveni came into power. And I hope that reading people in the NRM and current government, reading some of these things would help them maybe to avoid the kind of pitfalls that we are talking about for the future. I thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mbaine, for your comprehensive and provocative comments. We are scheduled to complete within around 15 minutes, but maybe if Moses, you would like to take a couple of minutes and respond, and then we can begin welcoming comments from the chat, and then also any raised hands for other comments that would like to come in. So Moses, let's hand this back over to you for initial response.
Yep. Thank you, John, and thank you, my brother Adolf, for your comprehensive and very well urged comments. I appreciate you reading the chapter and providing your reflections, and I think we are, for the most part, in agreement. I'll just take a few of the key issues that Adolf raised, and I don't have to respond to all of them because his were largely observations, and I'll definitely be happy to take them on and see how I can integrate them in the project. I think the Adolf, one of his first comments was about thinking about the NRM as the vehicle for Museveni, and not just the NRM, but it goes way back in time to from NASA and to PRA and then NRM before it becomes NRM government in '86, which speaks to what I said earlier about Museveni having been a specialist in violence, which was his first job. And then his second job, he's done two jobs. One as a specialist in violence who fought to come to power, to become
That's
president.
novel.
And then,
nobody has thought about that.
Yeah, and then his second job has been president of Uganda for almost 40 years now. Yeah, so the evolution of his sort of social organization and social base is definitely part of the story and cannot be neglected. And so in many ways, he's a product of our history. There's no doubt about that. And his long rule is not an accident. It's not. It has to be understood within Uganda's own long and checkered history. Going not just to independence times, but even to colonial times as well. And Adolf is right that Museveni of Fronasa, Museveni of PRA, of NRA, and Museveni of '86 was a very progressive person, and this is where I disagree with many people, perhaps including my very good friend Nelson Kasfa, who is on the call here, about sort of what we are talking about has been with us from the beginning. I think that is right, but it is also true that actually Museveni has changed a great deal. Museveni of '86, the idealist Museveni, was able to convince young university graduates in 1984-85 to leave their last lecture at Makerere and head straight to Wero to go and fight. We have those cases of individuals at Makerere, and I've had first-hand accounts, and you read John Kazora's book. These guys were so convinced in the in the project, in the Museveni project. And the articulate Museveni of 1986 was speaking about, leaders who don't want to leave power, and talking about, why it makes zero sense to go attend the UN General Assembly when your citizens back home are walking bare feet. These were very convincing and persuasive arguments about the need to change Uganda, and which also touches on Adolf's point about the nature of the post-colonial state. I mean, Museveni, this whole project is also puzzling because Museveni actually fought precisely to do, Adolf, what you're saying, change the post-colonial state. All right. So why hasn't he changed it? Okay. Or why has he not changed it in ways that we think he should have changed it, or in ways that he actually set out to change, which speaks to the fact that, and this is another point of yours which is important, and what we are doing in this book really is not to reduce the issue to Museveni the person. We have to situate Museveni in Uganda's broader social political context, and so the different chapters in the book are trying to explain, from different angles, how we get to where we are. It's not just about Museveni. It's about so many other actors, including, Uganda's political parties. They have contributed in different ways. They have been victims of Museveni's rule, but they have also been enablers of his long stay in power. So we deal with these issues in a more sort of nuanced and problematized way, not just to reduce the issue to Museveni, the individual. Of course, he is the most important actor. There's no other person that has been more important in Ugandan politics since 1986 than Museveni. And so there's no way at the end of the day you can write about politics in Uganda over the last 40 years and not place Museveni at the center of it. He's at the center, but he's not the only actor and he's not the only factor at play. And then, Adolf is right. Many achievements, of course, were made along the way, including restoring macroeconomic stability. And these have been dealt with in a lot of studies, which we don't have to rehash. My concern as a Ugandan, now speaking aside as a scholar and speaking as a Ugandan, my concern is that a lot of these great achievements that Museveni brought about are under threat of being wiped away. When I say we sit on precipice, I mean that whatever stability and security that we are talking about today is in a state of uncertainty. Even the economy that has worked modestly well, it's not the miracle that many people make it out to be, but it's been a modest economic environment in Uganda, not out of the ordinary when you compare with our regional peers. It's not that Museveni has presided over a miracle in Uganda, but it's that he's done modestly well in maintaining a fairly stable macroeconomic environment. But until Uganda negotiates the presidential succession question, all those excellent things that have happened are in peril. We could very well implode and everything that had been achieved is wiped away. And this is if I were Museveni, I would be deeply interested in that because, his own pedigree and legacy is on the line, but maybe he no longer cares about his legacy anymore. So the 7 key concerns, Adolf, that you raised, I think, I'm mostly in agreement. I would only quickly say that, you are highlighting basically the features of the autocratic landscape in Uganda and the fact that, those are sort of the indicators that somebody could, outline. You raised 7 of them, somebody could raise perhaps 20. And in my view, I think things just keep going the wrong way. I don't know, maybe I'm just a little bit pessimistic, but I see every year we seem to be getting worse. And you talk about the media, as you know, I write for the Daily Monitor. Every day I wake up fearing that my column is going to be suspended from the Daily Monitor. I don't know. But I'll pause there, John, and turn it over back to you for the audience.
Thank you, Moses, very much. So we have some comments already in the chat. Florence asks, how about the Muhoozi project? Balam Ankunda states that Museveni has created a dependence. And then Christopher Muhozi has an excellent comment. Christopher, would you like to, I'm happy to read the comment, or would you like to articulate the point?
Go ahead and read it. That's all I would say. Thank you.
Okay, so Christopher Muhozi states, I am wondering, taking a cue from Adolf, if Museveni is a product of Uganda's history, how much of what has happened in Uganda since 1986 can be attributed to him? Is there a risk of giving him credit and blame alike for everything that has happened? Yet there are likely other actors that have significantly shaped his decisions and actions. So we have that excellent comment. And then Nelson, if you would like, please go ahead and raise your point, and then we can return to Adolf and Moses unless there are a few additional comments.
Thank you, John. And thank you, Moses. It really was an excellent presentation. And I know how much work you put into this talk. I want to raise one very small point because we haven't got very much time. How about thinking of adaptability as a declining resource for Museveni? That is changing over time. That is, another hypothesis would be that it's changing over time rather than being constant. And one good indication of this is a contradiction, which I think I heard in your talk, between whether the building of a coalition as represented by the cabinet is a response to social forces, balancing social forces, or as you said at the end, that he's simply appointing people who will be supporting him, toadies, not representing social forces that he has to contend with, that he doesn't see himself as contending with it. So that declining adaptability might be replaced by increasing rigidity.
Thank you very much, Nelson. Do we want to get any additional comments before we hand this back over? Don't see any hands raised. No hands raised. Okay. So Moses and Adolf, if you would like to think about these comments, that would be wonderful.
I can go first. I think Christopher asked something about if Museveni is the product of our history, then what good is he responsible for, and what good and bad is he responsible for, and what about other people? I should say that, of course, yes, my view that Mr. Museveni is the product of our history is because he grew up in the turbulent times of the 60s and the 70s, and together with other people decided that they were going to try and change things for the better. And that is what he promised when he rose to power in 1986. He is to a certain degree responsible for what has come good and what has not come good, because he's been on the stage longest, and he's probably enjoyed more power and authority in the Ugandan state since independence than any other head of state we perhaps have had. He's also ruled longest, and that is that is quite clear. And so, yes, it is true. Under his watch, certain good things have happened. It is also true that under his watch, certain problems have occurred, and so on. And yeah, that is all I can say. And Moses, I think Moses, there is, I don't know whether you have read Professor John Jean Varga's paper that he presented in 2017 at a Makerere University convention that I was involved in. I'll pass it on to you if you haven't seen it. But in that paper also, Professor Varga raises the character of one of the characteristics of the Ugandan state as neo-patrimonial. And I find that argument quite interesting. I didn't mention it when I spoke, but I think that probably also explains what somebody else has raised in the chat about certain projects and so on. And what you also raised about the kind of cabinet that Mr. Museveni is working with now are, you know, people who at the surface, at the face of it may seem to hold power, but sometimes they don't, or many times they don't. And I think that ties in very well with the thesis of your text about the direction in which we are likely to be going. I thank you. Over to you, Moses.
Yeah, and John, I think we are almost out of time, but perhaps we could have another 15 minutes. It's perfectly okay with me. I don't know whether it's fine with Adolf and other colleagues who are on the call, but I'm happy to stay on for another 15 minutes. Adolf, is
I
it
think,
okay with you?
I think, oh, go ahead.
No, I was asking Adolf.
Yes, yes, please, yes. You were asking about whether I had some more little time to stay on.
Can we stay on for another 15 minutes?
Yeah, 15 minutes is fine. Yes, no problem.
Yeah. John, so let me take Nelson's question first, and then I'll get to the others as well. I hadn't thought about sort of adaptability as declining, and thank you for pointing that out, Nelson. I think it's an excellent way of seeing this. And as you were talking, I was thinking about, you know, how Museveni used to be very persuasive and could, you know, argue and could impress upon people to follow him, you know, to go and fight. He needed not to, you know, pay them or coerce them, right? You know, and I think he did a great deal of that in the first 10, 15 years of his rule as well, where he was a lot more persuasive and compelling and adapted using those sort of non-material and non-coercive resources than what he's had to do in the later stages of his rule, whereby, you know, adaptability, I think, has become a lot more tenuous and a lot more, you know, expensive, you know, has to use more money. So, you know, as Nelson, as you know from your argument about, you know, late stage clientelism, you know, it's become more pervasive and you know, and needing a lot more resources. So adaptability in that sense is sort of on the decline. You know, it's become more difficult to do things. You know, by, you know, staying for another year is you know, costs more money and costs more use of force than it were in the past. And so I think, if I understood well, Nelson, what you're saying, I think that's kind of how I would interpret it, that, you know, the longer it takes to adapt, the more difficult it is to do it. And so in that sense, that resource of adapting keeps declining and keeps weakening. And then I think your point about the sort of contradiction between Museveni, you know, his governing coalition being about, on the one hand, you know, representing different social groups and social interests, and on the other hand, having a coalition that basically serves his interests, right? So I don't think the two are actually at odds with one another. In fact, it has always been his strategy to combine both, you know, appealing and appeasing different social groups in Uganda, be they, you know, ethnic groups, religious, regional, you know, and other, you know, interest groups. On the one hand, he's, you know, Museveni is always appointing people to government positions with an eye on who does, you know, which interest group does that person represent. Okay, so the vice president is appointed because she supposedly represents the women interest group, the women social group. The vice president is also appointed because she comes from Teso and represents that regional, you know, dimension. But I think he's also appointed people like those to his cabinet with an eye on, you know, can they do the bidding for him? So I think he's able to balance both. right? His own interests as a ruler, but also try and make sure that he's appealing to a wide spectrum of popular mass spectrum out there, and that's sort of how I would see it. I think John, the questions from the chat, there was somebody who was asking about the Muhoozi project. I don't know how much I can say about the Muhoozi project. I've written about it in my column a few times. It's a complicated matter. Recently, somebody was asking me whether, Ugandans would be able to keep up with Museveni's son after Museveni has ruled the country for 40 years. And whether people in the military and other sectors, how they would respond. For me, it just makes matters worse. I wish there was nothing like that. If you asked me at a personal level, I would say the whole Muhoozi project just further poisons the well in ways that we don't need. And then there was, I think, a point about Museveni creating dependency. Yep, I think I couldn't agree more. That's been part of the arrangement. And then there was somebody John in the chat. I think Aisha was asking, sort of, there are no tools left to disentangle from the jaws of this autocracy. Sort of a rather resigned comment from Aisha about, we are completely stuck and we have exhausted ways of turning the corner. I'm not that resigned, by the way, Aisha. I think that it's possible to turn around things. And my own sort of proposal has been that there has to be a way of renegotiating the rules of engagement for Ugandan politics. Because the 1995 constitutional consensus long collapsed. Ugandan political elites are going to have to get back to the round table and have a conversation about governing Uganda in a different way going forward. So I think that the tools are not yet completely exhausted, my sister Aisha. But for me, the ball is in Museveni's court. It's him who can save the country and let it move in a direction away from him, or it's him who can nevertheless sink the boat, because he holds a lot of leverage. Nobody else holds more power than him in terms of how things go forward. Okay, John, I'm going to stop there and think Joshua was having his hand up.
Yep, please, Joshua, please take the floor.
Yes, thank you so much, Moses and Adolf, for the presentation and the rather interesting discussion we've had. Moses, permit me to review the manuscript before it's even published. And two important questions, I think. The first point I would make would be to kind of ask how this notion of adaptability fits into the arbitrary states argument that we have talked about from Tapscott's latest book, and the question of the extent to which arbitrariness in rule or as a mode of rule fits into this notion of adaptability. My second point has something to do with your level of analysis. I think the discussion has been very much focused on the state level of analysis and even from the individual level of analysis, to the extent that Museveni is really the main actor and you take him to be the main source of solution. I think what is missing here is to consider the Ugandan society and what it is about the Ugandan society itself that may allow for the style of rule that Museveni has institutionalized. And in the context of this, I would particularly think about the extent to which Museveni has instrumentalized, for example, poverty, and the extent to which the instrumentalization of poverty has been an important tool of anesthetizing the sort of social, societal responses, or for that matter, negation of his role. Thank you.
So Moses, if you would like to respond, and then we've got a few more minutes after that, and maybe Adolf might have comments as well.
Sure. Yeah, John, I'll just use 1 minute actually to quickly respond to my young brother, Joshua. And then, you know, we can wrap up in the next few minutes. Yeah, so so Joshua, you know, thanks for pre-reviewing the manuscript before you actually review it when it comes to you at some point. Yeah, I hadn't thought about the arbitrary state argument and how it potentially can either complement or contradict the notion of adaptability that I'm working with. My initial reaction is to say I see arbitrariness as a feature and as a component of, you know, the broader spectrum of adaptive, because, you know, the arbitrary state in Uganda, I think, has had quite a range of permutations over the long period Museveni has been ruling, and it's been, you know, it's been manifest in different ways, which to me sort of, you know, speaks to sort of the dynamism of, you know, the system. You know, the system has been quite dynamic. Now, as to whether that dynamism is down to Museveni the person, again, to your second point, I think it's, you know, it's open to debate. You know, I think the dynamism definitely goes beyond Museveni. And in the book, we try not to, as I pointed out earlier, to be so reductionist and think about this all as beginning and ending with Museveni, the individual, and Museveni, the president. So, you know, and I agree with your point about, you know, society and the social structure and social context is definitely very much part of the picture here. And so we have, I think, chapter 2 that deal with understanding the social landscape, specifically with regards to what generally has been referred to as civil society, and how the civil societal landscape has both been a reflection of the politics, but also has been an enabler of the politics at the same time. And so you know, the level of analysis argument, Joshua, that you point out, I think is well made. And you know, if in my talk I came off as, you know, restricting myself to state and individual and not talking to the social question, it was an oversight. But otherwise, the broader project and the broader thinking definitely goes beyond just, you know, state level and individual level analysis to include the social dynamics and social landscape in the country. John, over to you. John, you're muted.
Thank you, Moses. This has been a remarkable conversation. We've come to the end. I once again want to thank Moses and Adolf for their excellent comments and for their time, and wish to thank each of you for taking time out of your lives and busy schedules to be part of this wonderful conversation today. So once again, thank you very much. And I think we can call it a day, as we say.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Moses.
Thank you all
the participants.
Take care.
Thank you, the Uganda Study Group. Yeah.
Asante.
Yeah. Moses, we'll have you when you return to the city here.
My phone
I
as
don't know
well.
when that will be.
Sawa, soon.
Okay.
All right. Okay. Cheers.
Okay. Cheers.
All right.